auction company. And he made kind of a slip of the tongue. But it was basically what he meant to say. He said, where does privacy come from anyway? Increasingly, we find it comes from Europe.
So do we have another question?
That's actually the question, or it's going in the same directions. Why do you're Americans, and why do you want to set up an office in Brussels? So what are your, let's say, 3 key goals you pursue here? And also, how do you see your position in relation to organizations that are already there, like EDRI, for example? So you want to move?
You're right. So we're gonna wait and see. I think that's the most important thing. I mean, we're going in a fairly humble fashion. The people that we've been interviewing for the job are people strongly connected to EDRI and to the organizations that are around EDRI. We're very conscious that we don't want to kind of steal people. We want to be able to add something to the mix. And as far as issues goes, I think that's actually going to be, I don't imagine us coming in with any sort of bang. I think we're going to spend a great deal of the time spending a lot of time trying to work out what the best niche is. I think this is definitely something we've done in the past in other areas, where you sit and you try and work out, for instance, e-voting. E-voting was an area that we entered because it was clear that everybody felt that somebody should be there as a technical representative, working to help defend good electronic voting in the United States, but nobody had the time or resources. So it was a perfect niche for us to come and enter. So really, I think it's the first few months of that are going to spend just sitting there going, okay, what are people not covering? What do people want extra coverage on? You know, the software patent spike is probably pretty much tied down. Do we need more force on something like IPRED or what comes after IPRED and so forth? So my answer is that we don't quite know yet.
But I have a question. What do you say about the European Vorratsdatenspeicherung? I mean the data retention, that all the internet session, every pages, everything is stored. And what do you say about that? I mean, it's actually the bill is passed and it's gonna come if you want it or not.
So we probably don't have the legal expertise to give you the best advice about what you can do about those laws now that they're here. I guess in Germany you've got your constitutional protections for privacy that maybe will, give you something to fight back with. You've got, I understand that there was some recent court ruling holding that ISPs have to delete people's records at the moment if they request them to be deleted. So you've got an established tradition to work with. Maybe there are ways you can find to minimize the actual implementation impact of the direct connected skill places, or to get the Parliament to look at it again. I mean, we're fighting data retention, I think, in the United States as well, but it's a different kind of battle. We're sort of fighting it against battle against corporations individually. One sort of nice victory, like small victory that we had this year, came when AOL just catastrophically went out there, and they thought they were doing this for research purposes, but they released 3 months of their search logs. So they just had all of these people's search histories, and they thought they anonymized this data because they'd taken the IP addresses of it. But of course, when you look at someone's search history, that turns out to identify them in a hell of a lot of different ways. And in many cases, they'll have their name in there, or if they don't have their name in there, then they'll have just enough circumstantial evidence about their identity that you could figure out who they were if you wanted to. So that was an excellent opportunity for us to actually run a big campaign on the issue, and we managed to get some material out there explaining, first of all, to users how they can prevent these logs from being kept in the first place, and that's really quite hard to do, but it is possible. So we gave people the 6 steps you can follow to prevent Google or Yahoo or whoever is running your search engines from keeping these records on you, or being able to keep them. And the other thing that happened after that AOL example is that AOL's market share fell by So there's right, but it was a pretty sudden drop. So there's also pressure that we can sometimes put on private corporations in the US, and so in the US the battle is different. There is a large data retention law that's about to be implemented. I mean, there's a proposal kicking around.
There are, and one of the interesting examples of this sort of policy laundering is the moment that data retention went through on the EU. Attorney General Gonzalez began to announce that, well, perhaps it's not such a bad idea to have it in the United States, which is exactly the problem. And one of the data retention loss was a very big setback. And I think in many ways, you know, what you can try and draw from that is that hopefully it's such a big setback that there will be some successful challenges. Ireland's doing it, Germany are challenging this. One of the things one of the small victories during that process that I thought was very significant was in the original crazy suggestions done by my good fellow citizens in the UK was the list of things that they wanted to be retained involved things that were pretty much impossible to retain, things like MAC addresses. They wanted a log of all the MAC addresses that exist, and please keep those. And you know, the ISP. Well, that's a fairly easy one. You could probably define that in a few bytes. But thank you, Seth. And that was argued against because obviously there are very few technical designs of networks that keep MAC addresses for any length of time. And one of the things that we try and encourage ISPs and service providers to do is we shout this from the rooftops, is keep less logs, because this is precedent, right? If you keep logs, then eventually somebody's going to pass a law saying you have to keep those logs, or you have to pass those over. Organizations like Google, like Yahoo, like AOL are just creating huge honeypots, not just for their own corporate data mining purposes, but also for government and other investigations, right? So, and the data retention law is an excellent example of this. That if it was the case that these companies hadn't been keeping the sort of data that they had been keeping, then it would have been much harder for people to argue that suddenly that they should turn on these logs. So it's something that we really try and spread out to as many technical people as we can. And if you go to EFF.org/OSP, you'll see that we have some software and some guidance for doing the minimal amount of logging that you can on Apache and just in general, because you're just opening yourself up to having these sort of things
happen. I don't suggest this is an EFF position, but a well-known internet journalist is always making fun of data protection authorities, whom he refers to as those pesky European bureaucrats.
And their damn cat.
For failing to apparently, really prevent such horrors as data retention occurring in Europe. What's EFF's view on what kind of privacy legislation ought to exist in the US? Do you favor a horizontal data protection style law? And moreover, some American corporations, amazingly, are beginning to talk about a horizontal privacy law, federal privacy law in the US being a good idea. But there's some suspicion about whether or not that will be, in fact, a watering down of existing state privacy laws. So does EFF have a kind of model US privacy law in the can ready to advocate, or do you see your role really as confined to litigation and case law?
So what about, we're not pro or against legislation in general, but the general, and I'm not quite speaking from the mountain here on EFF official policy, but our general approach to this is we always worry with legislation about technical issues that it will either be too broad, it will say, anything that has a chip in it must do the following, or ridiculously narrow, anything that uses the 802.11 protocol must follow these things. Now, as far as data protection principles go, one of the reasons why it's often very hard to enforce them is because the technology changes so much that it's really hard to know what line to draw around these areas. I think because of our own bent, we try and think of ways of doing this to get them incorporated into the traditional ideas of civil liberties. So we really, really want to try and expand the protection of private data, the constitutional protection of private data, so that it doesn't matter who holds that data. It still has those kind of protections. But as far as model legislation, you'd have to wait until we saw the legislation. We've worked in helping draft legislation before, but these things can change between committee to committee. And it's really easy to take an incredibly well-meaning bill and then shatter it, even if it follows the principles you originally want. We've kind of been burnt by that in the past.
So, as far as I know, when you currently cross U.S. borders, the immigration officials have the right to confiscate your laptop, to copy your hard drive without any search warrant or anything. Are there any projects to fight this?
It turns out that borders are one of the areas of law that's sort of shockingly, I don't know what to say. Huh? Yeah, shockingly free of protections for individual rights, and has been for decades or hundreds of years. And we sort of forget because we travel, especially between the developed countries, very easily now with seemingly very little documentation. We entered the European Union, and they said, "Oh, welcome to the European Union," and that's it. But in principle, the state of the law in the U.S. has been for generations that the border people have a lot of authority. They don't have to follow the same kinds of protections for individual rights that regular law enforcement does. They don't, to the same extent, have to have a good reason for investigating you, for example. Normally, civilian law enforcement has to have a reason before they investigate you. They can't just say, well, he looked kind of weird or something, or he was carrying a laptop. So this is actually a fairly deep-seated situation. It's not, from the point of view of the law, it's not some strange aberration. From the point of view of business travelers, it's kind of surprising that you never had any clearly protected legal rights, but that was the situation. The people who are perhaps most upset about this are associations of business travelers because they're concerned about trade secrecy. And if someone has a very valuable corporate trade secret on a laptop, they don't like the idea that a border agent may take it away into a room for a long time for no particular reason, and then come back and say, okay, you can enter the country. Because now that border agent has seen a lot of interesting information. I don't think that they're going to get legislation through to change this. I think that the meme that you would get in opposition is our border patrol agents are working very hard to protect our country against terrorism, and they need all the discretion that they can get, and they've had this discretion for generations, and if there are specific abuses, we have processes to remedy the specific abuses. I'd like to see proposals to deal with this. It's just my suspicion that you're going to get a response that's going to be about terrorism, and why do you want to handicap the border agents who are first line of defense against terrorism? And that's kind of the way a lot of political discourse in the U.S. has been going. John Perry.
It's not clear that they can force you to give up a password. If you have your entire hard disk password protected, it's not clear that they can have any effect on making you give up that password. They might stop you from entering the country, but it seems unlikely to do that.
So this kind of gives you a good general idea of how we would approach this kind of thing, in that it's not something that we necessarily would do, but we would pick out somebody like associations of businessmen who would have some sort of interest in that. We would try and advise them in two ways. We try and alert them to this issue